It was a quiet afternoon on the outskirts of town, the kind of day where life seemed to move at its own pace. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the road as cars passed by, each driver lost in their own world. Among them was Marcus Taylor, a hard-working father of two on his way home after a long day at the office. Marcus was the kind of man who kept to himself, avoided trouble, and believed in treating others with respect. But on this particular day, his life was about to take a dramatic turn he never saw coming. As Marcus drove along the stretch of highway, a pair of flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. His heart sank. He glanced at his speedometer, confused. He wasn't speeding, and his car was in good condition. What could this be about? He calmly signaled and pulled over to the shoulder of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. A sense of unease washed over him as he watched the police cruiser come to a stop behind him. The officer inside wasn't just any cop. He was well known around the community for all the wrong reasons. Officer Brad Keller had a reputation. Some called him strict, others whispered harsher words: racist, unfair, dangerous. He was a man who carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on intimidation. Many in the community had experienced his heavy-handed tactics, but nothing ever seemed to stick. Complaints filed against him would mysteriously disappear, and he always managed to escape accountability. Today, it seemed, Marcus was the unlucky target of his attention. Stepping out of his cruiser, Officer Keller adjusted his hat and began his slow, deliberate walk toward Marcus's car. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made Marcus's stomach tighten. He rolled down his window as the officer approached, trying to remain calm. "License and registration," Keller barked, his tone sharp and cold. Marcus complied immediately, reaching for his documents with steady hands. He handed them over, but Keller didn't even glance at them. Instead, his eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, a flicker of something unmistakable passing across his face. Marcus felt it, the judgment, the disdain. "What are you doing out here?" Keller demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "I'm just heading home," Marcus replied politely, keeping his tone steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" Keller didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned closer, his presence looming over the car window. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice firm. Marcus froze. "May I ask why, officer? Have I done something wrong?" "I said, step out of the vehicle," Keller repeated, louder this time. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, a subtle yet undeniable threat. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt and opening the door. As he stepped out, he felt the eyes of passing drivers on him, their gazes a mix of curiosity and pity. Keller wasted no time. "Hands on the hood," he commanded. Marcus complied, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening. He had done nothing wrong. Why was this happening to him? What followed was nothing short of humiliating. Keller began searching Marcus's car, tossing items onto the ground carelessly, as though he were trying to find something, anything, to justify his actions. All the while, Marcus stood there, his hands pressed against the hot metal of the car's hood, feeling exposed and powerless. "Where are you hiding it?" Keller asked suddenly, his voice dripping with accusation. "Hiding what?" Marcus replied, his confusion genuine. "I have nothing to hide." But Keller wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. To him, Marcus wasn't an innocent man. He was a suspect, someone who didn't belong on this road, in this neighborhood, in this moment. The officer continued his search, pulling out bags, papers, and personal belongings, scattering them across the asphalt as though they were meaningless. Drivers passing by began to slow down, some even taking out their phones to record the scene. It was a small glimmer of hope for Marcus, proof that someone out there might see what was happening, that someone might care. And then, just as Keller was about to finish his search, something happened that no one could have predicted. A voice rang out from the crowd that had begun to gather nearby. "Hey, officer, what's going on here?" It was a woman, her tone firm and unwavering. She had seen enough and wasn't about to stay silent. Keller turned toward her, his face tightening in annoyance. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am," he snapped. But she didn't back down. In fact, more people began stepping forward, their voices joining hers. "Why are you harassing him? He didn't do anything wrong. We're recording this." For the first time, Keller hesitated. The weight of the public's gaze began to shift the power dynamic. Marcus, still standing by his car, felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. But what happened next would leave everyone stunned, both the onlookers and Keller himself. It was a moment that would spark conversations, challenge perceptions, and shine a light on an issue far too many had chosen to ignore. And it all started with one man's courage to endure and a community's decision to stand up. As the tension in the air thickened, Marcus couldn't help but glance at the small crowd that had gathered. Their voices, once murmurs of curiosity, were growing louder and more determined. It was clear they weren't just witnesses anymore, they were participants in this moment. For Marcus, it was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because he wasn't entirely alone, and terrifying because he had no idea how Officer Keller would react to the growing attention. Keller's grip on the situation seemed to falter slightly. His eyes darted between Marcus, the crowd, and the items he had thrown on the ground during his search. For a man used to being in control, the shift in power was unsettling. He stood up straight, squaring his shoulders as if to reassert his authority. But the more he postured, the more the crowd pushed back. "Why don't you just tell us what you're looking for?" the woman who had first spoken out said. Her voice was steady, but her arms were crossed tightly, her stance unyielding. Keller didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Marcus. "Don't move," he ordered, his tone sharp. Marcus nodded silently, his hands still resting on the hood of his car. He could feel the heat of the metal seeping into his skin, a stark reminder of his vulnerability in this moment. Marcus's mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. Why had Keller pulled him over in the first place? Was this really about some kind of suspicion, or was it something deeper, something uglier? He hated to think that it might be about the color of his skin, but he couldn't ignore the possibility. Stories like this weren't new. He had heard them before, from friends, from family, even on the news. But he never imagined he'd be living one himself. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as Keller continued his search, pulling apart Marcus's belongings with increasing frustration. Papers from his briefcase were scattered across the ground, along with a pair of children's toys that Marcus had picked up for his daughters earlier that day. One of the toys, a small stuffed bear, rolled toward the edge of the road. A child in the crowd stepped forward to pick it up, but their parent quickly pulled them back, sensing the tension in the air. "Look at this mess," someone muttered from the crowd. "He's not going to find anything." Marcus wanted to agree, but he stayed silent. He knew better than to speak out, even if every part of him was screaming to defend himself. The stories he'd grown up hearing from his father played in his mind like warnings. "Stay calm, stay respectful, and don't give them a reason to escalate," his father used to say. "Your life is worth more than your pride." But how long could he stay calm? How much longer could he endure this humiliation? Marcus swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus on his breathing. In and out, steady and slow. He didn't want to make a mistake, not now, not with so many eyes watching. "Still nothing, huh?" a man in the crowd called out sarcastically, breaking the tense silence. Keller shot him a glare, his jaw tightening. The officer's frustration was palpable now, his movements growing more aggressive as he searched through Marcus's car. But no matter how hard he looked, it was clear he wasn't finding what he had hoped for. Keller straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants as if to rid himself of his failure. His eyes locked onto Marcus, who stood motionless by the car. "What are you hiding?" Keller demanded, his voice rising. "Nothing," Marcus said softly, shaking his head. "I've told you, I'm just heading home. Don't lie to me." Keller snapped, taking a step closer. "You're telling me there's nothing in this car that I should know about?" "Nothing illegal," Marcus replied, his voice still calm but firm. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on him, their collective presence giving him a sliver of courage. Keller's eyes narrowed, as if trying to read Marcus's thoughts. For a moment, it seemed like the officer might explode, his frustration boiling over. But then, something unexpected happened. A man stepped forward from the crowd, his phone held high in the air. "Officer," the man said loudly, "we're all watching, and we're recording. You might want to think about what you're doing here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Keller's face darkened. He turned toward the man, his hand instinctively brushing against his holster again. The crowd tensed, a ripple of unease spreading through them. But the man didn't back down. Instead, he took another step forward, his phone still pointed at the officer. "This isn't right," the man continued. "You've searched his car, You've humiliated him, and you haven't found anything. Why don't you let him go? Marcus felt a flicker of hope as he listened to the man's words. Maybe this nightmare was finally coming to an end. But then, Keller's voice cut through the air like a blade. Stay back, he barked, his hand now fully gripping the holster of his gun. The crowd gasped, their fear palpable. Even Marcus felt his heart stop for a moment. He wanted to say something, to defuse the situation, but the words caught in his throat. Hey, calm down, another voice from the crowd shouted. There's no need for that. The tension was unbearable now, the air so thick with it that Marcus could hardly breathe. Keller's eyes darted between the man with the phone and the rest of the crowd. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsure of what to do. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. Step back, Keller repeated, his voice trembling slightly. But the crowd didn't move. If anything, they grew closer, their collective presence pressing in on him like an unyielding force. Marcus watched all of this unfold, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone standing there, everyone who had ever faced a moment like this and felt powerless. He knew he had to say something, anything, to stop this from spiraling further out of control. Officer, Marcus said softly, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. Keller turned to him, his eyes narrowing. I don't want any trouble, Marcus continued. I just want to go home to my family. That's all. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The crowd fell silent, their eyes shifting between Marcus and Keller. Even the officer seemed to hesitate, his grip on his holster loosening slightly. It was as if Marcus's words had reached some part of him, however small, that still understood reason. But just as quickly as the moment of calm appeared, it was shattered. The sound of a car door slamming behind the crowd made everyone jump, including Keller. A second police cruiser had pulled up unnoticed, and another officer was now walking toward the scene. What's going on here? The new officer asked, his tone firm but less aggressive than Keller's. The crowd parted slightly, giving him a clear view of Marcus and Keller. Back up, someone whispered in the crowd. Maybe this guy will actually do something. Marcus didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. The arrival of another officer could mean help, or it could mean escalation. Either way, the tension wasn't going away. Not yet. The second officer walked with purpose, his expression unreadable as he approached the tense scene. His uniform was neatly pressed, and his movements were calm yet deliberate, a stark contrast to Keller's rigid, aggressive stance. Marcus shifted slightly, his hands still on the hood of his car, as he glanced toward this new arrival. He wasn't sure whether to feel hopeful or wary. The crowd quieted just enough to hear what would happen next, their phones still raised, capturing every second. Keller, the new officer said, his voice steady but firm, what's going on here? His eyes moved from Keller to Marcus and then to the scattered belongings on the ground. It was clear he was taking in the scene, piecing together the story without anyone having to say a word. Routine stop, Keller replied sharply, his tone defensive. This guy was acting suspicious, and I'm conducting a search. The second officer raised an eyebrow, his skepticism apparent. He looked at Marcus, who stood silently, his face a mix of fear and exhaustion. Then his gaze shifted to the crowd, their expressions filled with concern and defiance. The officer seemed to sense that this wasn't just any traffic stop, it was something bigger, something heavier. Suspicious, huh? The officer said, his tone carrying a hint of doubt. Did you find anything? Keller hesitated for a moment, his jaw tightening. Not yet, he admitted, his frustration evident. But I'm not done here. The second officer let out a slow breath, glancing at the mess Keller had made of Marcus's belongings. He crouched down, picking up one of the papers that had been tossed onto the ground. It was a drawing, a crayon sketch of a smiling family, clearly made by a child. He held it up for a moment, then placed it carefully on the hood of the car. Keller, he said quietly, standing up again, why don't we take a step back for a moment? I've got this under control, Keller snapped, his voice rising. I don't need you interfering. It doesn't look like you have it under control, the second officer replied calmly, his tone unwavering. He turned to Marcus, his expression softening slightly. Sir, can you tell me what's going on? Marcus hesitated, unsure of what to say. He glanced at Keller, who was glaring at him, then back at the second officer. I don't know, he said finally, his voice shaky. I was just driving home. He pulled me over and started searching my car. I don't know what he's looking for. The second officer nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Do you have any idea why he stopped you? No, Marcus replied. He didn't tell me. I wasn't speeding, and everything in my car is legal. I don't understand why this is happening. The officer turned back to Keller, his eyes narrowing slightly. Did you have probable cause for this search? Keller's face flushed red. I know what I'm doing, he snapped. This guy was acting suspicious, and I don't need to explain myself to you. Yes, you do, the second officer said firmly. If you didn't have probable cause, then this search is illegal. You know that. The crowd murmured in agreement, their confidence growing now that someone was standing up to Keller. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, but he knew better than to let his guard down. This wasn't over, not yet. Keller's hands balled into fists at his sides, his frustration boiling over. Are you seriously questioning me in front of these people? He hissed. You're undermining my authority. No, the second officer replied evenly, I'm doing my job. And right now, my job is to make sure this situation doesn't escalate any further. For a moment, it seemed like Keller might lash out. His entire body was tense, his face a mask of barely contained anger. But then, he took a step back, his hands dropping to his sides. The second officer turned to Marcus again. Sir, he said gently, I'm going to ask you to stay right here while I talk to Officer Keller. Is that okay? Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. Okay. The second officer motioned for Keller to follow him a few steps away from the car, out of earshot of the crowd. The two began speaking in low voices, their expressions serious. Marcus couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the tension between them. Keller gestured angrily toward the car, while the second officer remained calm, his hands clasped behind his back. The crowd watched intently, their phones still recording. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what would happen next. Maybe he's finally going to stop this, one woman said. It's about time someone stood up to that guy. Marcus stood by his car, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the hood. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely relieved. For the first time since this nightmare began, it seemed like someone might actually be on his side. But as the two officers continued their heated discussion, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, about power, about justice, about the kind of world his daughters would grow up in. He thought about their faces, their laughter, the way they ran to hug him when he walked through the door after a long day. He thought about how much he wanted to see them again, to hold them and tell them everything was okay. The second officer finally turned back toward the car, his expression serious but calm. Keller followed, his face dark with anger. The second officer approached Marcus, his voice steady but firm. Sir, he said, I've spoken with Officer Keller, and I want to apologize for what you've been put through. You're free to go. We'll help you gather your belongings. Marcus blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. I can go? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, the second officer said with a nod. You haven't done anything wrong. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, some even clapping softly. Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him, relief, exhaustion, and a lingering sense of disbelief. He nodded slowly, his hands shaking as he began to pick up his belongings from the ground. The second officer crouched down to help, placing the papers and toys back into the car with care. Keller stood off to the side, his jaw clenched and his fists tight. He didn't say a word, but his anger was evident. Marcus avoided looking at him, focusing instead on gathering his things and steadying his breathing. As Marcus climbed back into his car, he glanced at the crowd one last time. Their faces were a mix of relief and determination, their phones still pointed toward him. He gave them a small nod, a silent thank you for their support. But as he started the engine and pulled back onto the road, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. What had happened to him wasn't just a random act of injustice, it was a symptom of something much larger. And while he was grateful to be driving home to his family, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen the next time someone like Keller decided to wield his power unfairly. The road stretched out ahead of him, the sun dipping lower in the sky. As he drove, Marcus thought about the people who had stood up for him, about the second officer who had stepped in, and about the countless others who might not have been so lucky. The fight for justice wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Marcus knew he couldn't forget this moment, no matter how much he wanted to leave it behind. As Marcus drove away from the scene, His hand still trembled against the steering wheel. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting Keller to follow him, to find some excuse to stop him again. The faces of the crowd lingered in his mind, their courage, their determination. It had been their presence, their voices, that had made Keller think twice, and Marcus couldn't help but feel an overwhelming gratitude. But beneath the relief, there was something else, something heavier. Anger. Frustration. A simmering sense of injustice that wouldn't fade, no matter how far he drove. The road ahead was empty, the sun sinking below the horizon and casting long shadows across the pavement. Marcus focused on the lines dividing the highway, letting their rhythm steady his breath. But as the distance grew between him and the chaos he'd just escaped, his thoughts refused to quiet. Why had Keller been so determined? Why had he searched so frantically, even when it was clear there was nothing to find? There was something about the way the second officer had looked at him, something unspoken but telling, that made Marcus feel this wasn't the end of it. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, jolting him out of his thoughts. At the next stoplight, he glanced down and saw a string of missed calls from his wife, Rachel. Guilt washed over him. She must have been worried sick. He picked up the phone and dialed her back, putting the call on speaker as he continued driving. Marcus. Rachel's voice came through, a mixture of relief and panic. Are you okay? I've been trying to reach you for hours. I'm okay, Marcus said quickly, though his voice betrayed the lingering tension. I'll explain everything when I get home. I need a little time to process. There was a pause, and he could hear her take a shaky breath. What happened? Are you in trouble? No, Marcus assured her. It's not like that. I got pulled over, and things got out of hand. But I'm fine now. I'm on my way. Rachel was silent for a moment, then said softly, just come home. We'll talk when you get here. Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I will. I love you. I love you too, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The call ended, and Marcus set the phone back in the cup holder. The warmth of her words gave him some comfort, but it wasn't enough to shake the unease that clung to him. As he approached the turnoff for his neighborhood, Marcus noticed headlights in his rearview mirror, closer than they should have been. A car was tailing him, its beams cutting through the dark like sharp blades. His heart skipped a beat. Was it Keller? Had the officer decided he wasn't done yet? Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel, his pulse quickening. He took a deep breath and told himself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was another driver, someone in a hurry to get home. But as he turned onto his street, the car followed, keeping the same unnervingly close distance. Marcus's chest tightened. He pulled into his driveway and parked, watching as the car slowed down but didn't stop. Instead, it crept past his house, its headlights sweeping across his front yard before disappearing down the street. Marcus sat in the car for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was probably nothing, he told himself. Just someone taking a wrong turn. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, wouldn't leave him. He got out of the car and walked toward the front door, glancing over his shoulder more than once. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of crickets. Inside, the house was warm and familiar, the scent of dinner still lingering in the air. Rachel was waiting for him in the living room, her face pale with worry. She stood as soon as he walked in, rushing to him and wrapping her arms around his shoulders. What happened? She asked, pulling back just enough to look at him. You're shaking. Marcus sat down on the couch, his body feeling heavier than it had all day. He told her everything, the stop, the search, the crowd, the second officer. He tried to downplay the fear he had felt, but Rachel could see through him. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened, her hand gripping his tightly. Marcus, this isn't right, she said when he finished. You can't just let this go. He had no right to treat you like that. I know, Marcus said quietly. But what can I do? It's my word against his. It's not just your word, Rachel said, her voice firm. There were witnesses. People recorded it. We can do something. We had to do something. Marcus leaned back against the couch, closing his eyes. He wanted to believe she was right, but he was so tired of fighting, tired of feeling powerless. I don't know, Rachel. I just want to forget it ever happened. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. Both of them froze, the sound sharp and unexpected in the stillness of the house. Marcus exchanged a glance with Rachel, his heart pounding. Who could it be at this hour? Rachel stood, her hand resting on his shoulder for a moment before she walked to the door. She looked through the peephole and hesitated, her body tensing. "It's a police officer," she whispered. Marcus's stomach dropped. He stood up slowly, his mind racing. Was it Keller? Was he here to intimidate him, to make sure he stayed silent? Marcus walked to the door and opened it, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't Keller. It was the second officer, the one who had stepped in and de-escalated the situation. He stood on the porch, his expression serious but calm, the same way he had looked at the scene earlier. "Mr. Carter," the officer said, addressing Marcus by name. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wanted to talk to you about what happened today." Marcus glanced back at Rachel, who was watching with wide eyes, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. "What is it?" he asked, his voice cautious. The officer hesitated, glancing around the quiet street before speaking. "There's something you should know. I can't say much, but Keller's actions today were not okay. I've already filed a report about his behavior, and there's an internal investigation underway." Marcus stared at him, his mind reeling. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you deserve to know," the officer said. "And because I want you to understand that not all of us are like him. There are people in the department who want to see change, who want to do the right thing." Marcus felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, relief, but also lingering anger. "And what happens if nothing changes?" he asked. "What happens the next time someone like Keller pulls over someone like me?" The officer looked at him for a long moment, his face troubled. "That's why people like you speaking out matters," he said finally. "I know it's not fair. I know it's not easy. But if we don't shine a light on these things, they'll keep happening." Marcus nodded slowly, his chest tight. He wanted to believe the officer, to believe that his voice could make a difference. But the memory of Keller's rage, the humiliation of being forced out of his car, still weighed heavily on him. The officer handed him a card with his name and contact information. "If you decide to take this further, I'll back you up," he said. "But whatever you choose to do, know that you're not alone." With that, he nodded and walked back to his car, leaving Marcus standing on the porch, the card clutched tightly in his hand. As the officer drove away, Marcus looked up at the night sky, the stars barely visible through the haze of the city lights. He felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, but he also felt a spark of something else, hope. He wasn't sure what he would do next, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Marcus stood on the porch for a long moment, the officer's card still in his hand. The cool night air brushed against his face, but it did little to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Rachel opened the door and stepped out, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him, her expression a mixture of worry and resolve. "What did he say?" she finally asked, her voice low. Marcus hesitated, unsure how to explain. "He said Keller's under investigation," he replied. "That I'm not alone, and if I want to take this further, he'll back me up." Rachel studied him, her eyes searching his face. "And what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know." Rachel reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But I think you need to do something, Marcus. Not just for yourself, but for everyone else who's been through something like this." He nodded slowly, her words sinking in. She was right. This wasn't just about him. It was about the bigger picture, about standing up to injustice and making sure Keller didn't have the chance to do this to anyone else. But the thought of going up against someone like Keller, of facing the backlash and the scrutiny, was overwhelming. As they went back inside, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "Careful who you trust. Not everyone's on your side." Marcus stared at the screen, his heart skipping a beat. Rachel leaned over to see the message, her brow furrowing. "Who sent that?" "I don't know," Marcus said, his voice tight. He felt a chill run down his spine as he read the words again. The message was vague, but the implication was clear, it was a warning. But from whom? And why? Rachel's grip on his arm tightened. "Marcus, this is serious. You need to report this." "To who?" Marcus asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "The police? What if it's one of them? What if this is their way of trying to scare me into staying quiet?" Rachel shook her head. "It doesn't matter. You can't just ignore it. If you let them intimidate you, they win." Marcus let out a heavy sigh, his mind racing. The officer who had visited him earlier seemed genuine, but the text message made him second-guess everything. What if Keller wasn't acting alone? What if there were others in the department covering for him? The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety crashing over him. That night, Marcus barely slept. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. The crowd, Keller, the second officer, the mysterious car that had followed him, and now the text message. It all felt connected somehow, but he couldn't piece it together. The next morning, Marcus decided to take a walk to clear his head. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with trees that swayed gently in the breeze. As he walked, he noticed a car parked a few houses down. It was the same car that had followed him the night before. His stomach dropped as he realized it wasn't a coincidence. Someone was watching him. He turned around and walked back toward his house, his pace quickening. When he reached his driveway, he glanced over his shoulder. The car was still there, the windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. He fumbled with his keys, unlocking the door and stepping inside as quickly as he could. Rachel was in the kitchen, making coffee. She looked up as he came in, her expression shifting to concern when she saw the look on his face. "What's wrong?" "That car," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "The one that followed me last night. It's parked down the street." Rachel's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Marcus said. "It's the same car. Someone's watching us." Rachel put down the coffee pot and walked to the window, peering out cautiously. She didn't say anything for a moment, then turned back to him. "We need to call someone." Marcus shook his head. "I don't know who to trust. What if they're connected to Keller? What if this is all part of some plan to silence me?" Rachel placed her hands on his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. "Marcus, you can't let fear control you. If you stay quiet, they win. But if you speak up, you can make a difference. You can show them that you're not afraid." Her words struck a chord, and Marcus felt a surge of determination. She was right. He couldn't let Keller or whoever was behind this scare him into submission. He had to take a stand, not just for himself but for his family and for everyone else who had been silenced by fear. That afternoon, Marcus began reaching out to the people who had been at the scene of the traffic stop. He found videos of the incident on social media, posted by witnesses who had recorded everything. The videos were already gaining traction, with comments pouring in from people expressing their outrage and support. Marcus also called the second officer, the one who had given him the card. The officer answered on the second ring, his tone calm but serious. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. I got a message," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "Someone's trying to scare me into staying quiet. And there's a car parked outside my house. It followed me last night." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I see," the officer said finally. "I'll look into it. But, Mr. Carter, you should know that if you choose to go public with this, things might get harder before they get better." Marcus clenched his jaw. "I'm not going to let them scare me. I've already come this far." The officer sighed. "All right, just be careful. And if anything else happens, call me immediately." After hanging up, Marcus felt a mix of fear and resolve. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to back down. The stakes were higher now, the danger more real, but so was his determination to see this through. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus sat on the couch with Rachel, their hands intertwined. The world outside their window felt heavier, darker, but inside, there was a spark of hope. Marcus had made his choice, and he was ready to face whatever came next. But as the night stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The next morning, Marcus woke up to a loud knock on the door. His heart jumped in his chest as he exchanged a glance with Rachel. They both knew this could mean trouble. He cautiously walked to the door and peeked through the peephole. It was the second officer, the one who had promised to help. But standing beside him was a man in a suit who looked far too polished to be just another officer. Marcus hesitated, his mind racing, but eventually, he opened the door. "Mr. Carter," the officer said, his tone serious. "This is Special Agent Harris with Internal Affairs. We need to talk." Rachel appeared behind Marcus, her hand lightly resting on his back. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. The agent stepped forward. "We've been investigating Officer Keller for some time now, and the incident with you has brought some alarming things to light. We believe Keller is part of a larger network within the department involved in illegal activities, tampering with evidence, coercion, even extortion." Marcus stared at him, his mind reeling. "What does that have to do with me?" Agent Harris' expression darkened. "You're a threat to him now. Your decision to speak up and the attention this has gained on social media have put pressure on him and his associates. That's why you've been followed, and why you received that warning message. Keller and his people are trying to intimidate you into silence." Marcus felt the weight of the agent's words settle on his chest. He thought about the car parked down the street, the cryptic text message, and the lingering fear that had followed him since the incident. "So what do I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The agent took a deep breath. "We need your help. If you're willing, we want you to file a formal complaint and agree to testify. Your case could be the key to exposing Keller and the others involved. But you need to be prepared. This won't be easy, and there's a chance they'll retaliate." Rachel squeezed Marcus's arm, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We'll do it," she said before Marcus could respond. He looked at her, surprised by her resolve, but her expression left no room for doubt. She wasn't just speaking for herself, she was standing with him, ready to face whatever came next. The rest of the day was a blur. Marcus spent hours at the precinct, recounting every detail of his encounter with Keller. The weight of his words felt heavy, but there was also a sense of relief in finally telling his story. The officers handling his statement assured him that the evidence, witness accounts, social media videos, and the investigation into Keller was strong. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Keller wouldn't go down without a fight. That night, Marcus and Rachel tried to settle back into their routine, but the tension lingered like a shadow over their home. As they sat in the living room, the silence was broken by the sound of tires screeching outside. Marcus jumped up and ran to the window, his stomach tightening when he saw Keller standing in the middle of the street. His face was twisted in anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Marcus Carter," Keller shouted, his voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "You think you can ruin my life and get away with it?" Rachel grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him back from the window. "Don't go out there," she whispered urgently. "Call the police." But before Marcus could react, Keller reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it up, and Marcus could see a video playing on the screen. It was footage of Keller himself, taken from a hidden camera, meeting with another officer in what looked like a parking garage. Their conversation was damning, filled with talk of bribes and cover-ups. "I don't care what you think you've got on me," Keller yelled. "You're not going to win. This whole system is rotten, and you're nothing but a pawn." Before Marcus could respond, flashing lights appeared at the end of the street. A line of police cars pulled up, and officers quickly surrounded Keller. Agent Harris stepped out of one of the cars, his expression unreadable as he approached. "Keller," Harris said firmly. "It's over. We have everything we need." Keller's face twisted into a sneer as he looked at Marcus. "You think this makes you a hero? You're just lucky. This fight isn't over." The officers moved in, placing Keller in handcuffs as he continued to rant, his voice growing fainter as they led him to one of the squad cars. Marcus watched the scene unfold, his emotions a whirlwind of relief, fear, and disbelief. He turned to Rachel, who wrapped her arms around him tightly. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. "You did it." But just as Marcus began to feel a sense of closure, Agent Harris approached him, his expression grave. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly. "There's something you need to see." He handed Marcus a file, and as he opened it, his heart sank. Inside were photos, documents, and transcripts that revealed the full extent of Keller's network. It wasn't just about corruption within the police department, it extended to local politicians, business leaders, and even community figures. The scope of it was staggering. "This is bigger than Keller," Harris said. "Taking him down is a step in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to do. And your name is out there now. They'll know you're a part of this." Marcus looked at Rachel, her face pale but determined. He thought about everything they'd been through, everything they'd risked, and realized this fight was far from over. But for the first time, he didn't feel powerless. He felt ready. As the night wore on and the street grew quiet again, Marcus sat on the couch with Rachel, the file resting on the coffee table in front of them. The fight wasn't over, but neither was their resolve. Together, they had faced their fears and taken a stand. And together, they would face whatever came next. The days following Keller's arrest felt surreal for Marcus and Rachel. Their once quiet home had become a flurry of activity: phone calls from reporters, messages of support from strangers, and updates from Agent Harris and his team about the ongoing investigation. It was overwhelming, but amidst the chaos, Marcus began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He had taken a stand, and it was making a difference. Rachel insisted on keeping things as normal as possible, especially for the kids. She made sure their daily routines stayed intact, shielding them from the full weight of what was happening. But even they could sense that something had changed. Marcus caught his son, Elijah, watching him closely one evening as they sat at the dinner table. "Dad," Elijah said hesitantly, "are you okay?" Marcus paused, looking at his son. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to respond. But then he smiled, reaching across the table to ruffle Elijah's hair. "I'm okay," he said. "Sometimes doing the right thing is hard, but it's always worth it." Elijah nodded, his young face thoughtful. "Are the bad guys gone now?" Marcus hesitated again. He wanted to say yes, to reassure his son that the danger had passed. But he also knew the truth was more complicated. "Some of them are," he said carefully. "But there's still work to do. That's why we have to be brave and keep doing what's right, even when it's scary." Elijah seemed to accept this, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But Marcus couldn't stop thinking about his words. There was still work to do, and he wasn't sure what role he would play in it. The idea of being in the spotlight, of continuing to fight against a system that had let Keller and others like him thrive, was daunting. But he also knew he couldn't turn back now. A week later, Marcus received a call from Agent Harris. The investigation had expanded, uncovering more members of Keller's network and implicating several high-ranking officials. Harris thanked Marcus for his courage, emphasizing that his decision to come forward had been a turning point in the case. "You've done more than you realize," Harris said. "This isn't just about Keller anymore. It's about holding an entire system accountable. And people are listening." After the call, Marcus sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. He thought about everything that had happened: the fear, the anger, the uncertainty. But he also thought about the people who had stood by him: Rachel, who had been his rock through it all; the witnesses who had shared their videos and stories; and even Agent Harris, who had proven that there were still good people within the system fighting for change. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a new normal. Marcus returned to work, grateful for the support of his colleagues and customers. He and Rachel continued to receive messages from people who had seen their story, many of them sharing their own experiences and thanking Marcus for speaking out. It was humbling and inspiring, and it reminded Marcus why he had chosen to fight in the first place. One afternoon, Marcus received an invitation to speak at a community event focused on police reform and racial justice. At first, he was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't something he was comfortable with, and the thought of reliving everything in front of a crowd was intimidating. But Rachel encouraged him, reminding him that his voice mattered. "You've already made a difference," she said. "This is just another way to keep the momentum going." The day of the event, Marcus stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest. The crowd was larger than he had expected, and the weight of their expectations felt heavy. But when he stepped onto the stage and looked out at the sea of faces, he realized he wasn't alone. These people weren't here to judge him. They were here because they believed in what he stood for. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady despite his nerves. He told his story, not just about what had happened with Keller, but about the lessons he had learned along the way. He talked about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and about the power of community and solidarity. When he finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him as he stepped off the stage, greeted by people thanking him and sharing their own stories. For the first time, he felt a sense of closure, not because the fight was over, but because he had found his place in it. In the months that followed, Marcus continued to be an advocate for change, working with local organizations and speaking out against injustice. He and Rachel remained cautious, knowing that not everyone welcomed their efforts, but they refused to let fear dictate their lives. One evening, as Marcus and Rachel sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rachel turned to him and smiled. "You know," she said, "when all of this started, I was so scared. But now, I feel proud. Proud of you, of us, of what we've done." Marcus reached for her hand, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. You kept me grounded. You reminded me why this matters. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past slowly giving way to a sense of peace. The world wasn't perfect, and the fight for justice was far from over. But for Marcus, this was enough. A reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible, and hope could endure. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Marcus felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for his family, his community, and everyone who believed in a better tomorrow. And with Rachel by his side, he knew he wouldn't have to face it alone.